Exclusive insights, actionable strategies, and ideas that ignite change. You're listening to the Ivey Impact Podcast from Ivey Business School.
Hello and welcome to Dialogue with the Dean, the flagship series on the Ivey Impact Podcast. I'm Julian Birkinshaw, Dean of the Ivey Business School. Canada is on the brink of a national building boom. The recent passage of Bill C-5, the One Canadian Economy Act, aims to fast-track major infrastructure projects, pipelines, ports, mines, clean energy corridors, and more, all in the name of economic growth and national resilience. But can this country actually get shovels in the ground? Why is it so hard to build anything big in Canada? What does this window of opportunity mean for firms navigating complex stakeholder landscapes? To help us tackle these questions is Adam Fremeth, Associate Professor of Business Economics and Public Policy here at Ivey. Adam is an expert on how firms engage with regulators, activists, and community stakeholders, particularly when the stakes are high and the spotlight is bright. Adam, welcome to Dialogue with the Dean. It's great to have you here.
Julian, thanks so much for having me today. Looking forward to the conversation.
Perfect. So I always want to start by asking you a little bit about how you got here. Just give us your brief sort of life story, as it were.
Oh, perfect. Great. Well, so Ivey's actually a place I've spent a lot of time. I did my undergraduate degree here and came back here following my doctoral degree in the U.S. And so I was really excited at the time in 2009 to return to Canada and have a role in leading Ivey and the important role that we play in educating business students and supporting the Canadian economy.
Got it. Adam, before we get into the main story around the C-5 Act, talk a little bit about some of your studies that you've done in the earlier part of your career. What's your big research agenda been?
Yeah, no problem. So like you mentioned, I'm in the Business Economics and Public Policy group at Ivey. And so it's a really unique group that we have here in Canada of scholars that are really understanding how firms engage with the external environment, right, policymakers, stakeholders, and in particular, in my case, the energy industry. Mm-hmm. And so a lot of the work that I focus in on is how firms try to shape policy and also respond to public policy, in particular the electricity utility sector. Mm-hmm. One that I think is obviously quite important in the future growth of our economy, that laid the groundwork from where we are here today, and also has an important role in improving the sustainability of the Canadian and global economies as well.
So this would be, for example, the extent to which electrical utilities are investing in renewable energy rather than using nuclear or hydro or whatever.
Yeah, well, that's right. So in particular, a lot of my work looked at how firms had a role in helping to craft the renewable energy policies that we have here in Canada and in the United States, how they've been meeting some of those demands and trying to stay on top of where the market could be going as well.
Let's get into the big question, which is, Canadian investment in big infrastructure projects. I've been living here now for a year and I've experienced it personally. Everybody tells me Canada's really bad at doing these big infrastructure projects. Give us a sense, and I don't think anybody's going to dispute that as a general proposition. Give us a sense of why. What are the reasons why it is so difficult and so slow to get these things moving?
Yeah, so let me go back in time a little bit on this, because it wasn't always the case, right? Canada for a long time was really good at nation-building projects. The Trans-Canada Highway, the rail line that went coast to coast, the gas mainline pipeline that went, from Western Canada to Eastern Canada, ports, the development of the St. Lawrence Seaway. We were really good for a long time at big infrastructure development. And for the past decade, really, we've seen what many consider the lost decade, right? That we had an opportunity to build out some key industries, some export-oriented industries, and nothing really happened, right? There's a real constraint on getting shovels in the ground, getting the capital that we need, and maintaining the capital in this country that's required. And so, that has had a detrimental impact on our economy.
So I was doing a little bit of research before our conversation. This is just data from the OECD, which is the big trans-country organization, Canada ranked second worst in the OECD for time required to obtain a general construction permit. And between 2006 and 2020, Canada fell from 4th to 23rd place in the World Bank's ease of doing business ranking. So your point is substantiated, if you like, by hard data. What went wrong? What has happened over the last 10 or 15 years to slow things down? So.
Yeah, I think we just ran into a lot of obstacles in getting the support that we need from policymakers, and blame could be passed across the board at different levels of our government to not provide the supports needed for firms to actually build the projects out that are required. And this means all different levels of support, right? Making sure that you've got the support on labor that are required, opening up the borders to trade and investment so you've got the inputs that you need, and ensuring that firms are wanting to invest in this country. I could say around 2014, so just about 10 years ago, we had a mass exodus of foreign firms that were investing in the oil and gas sector in Canada. We had all the large companies here. We had Total from France, you had the Koreans, you had the Japanese, and so all of a sudden, we had a drop in the oil price, but also the constraints on building new projects just, vanished. And so that is a real detriment to us. And so I think it's making sure that we've got the supports needed, it really speaks to the data that you had provided here, that you can't be investing hundreds of millions or, billions of dollars in the ground to not actually see a project come to fruition because you get slowed down in some processes that we had. And some of these processes were well-intentioned. And some of them actually created a lot of hurdles.
And to sort of push a little bit on the Canada-specific parts of this, because having lived most of my life in the UK is terrible at infrastructure projects as well. And there's always a sort of a conversation about why does the UK do it so badly. Canada's got some unique challenges. Obviously, the physical size is one. Is Canada, the different branches of government, are they pandering too much to too many different stakeholder groups? Is that part of the problem? Because the more stakeholder groups whose voice finds its way into the conversation, obviously, the more things get slowed down. That's just a question, really. I don't know.
I think that's an important part of it. Right? I think it's getting the right people in the room and having constructive, productive conversations to make things happen. And also, entering in these conversations with best intentions, right? Not, the goal to create obstacles or perhaps to keep the resources in the ground, but also thinking about how we could do this better than other countries. And this is the challenge when you talk about resource extraction, which is, where Canada has its greatest comparative advantage, going back to the massive size of who we are. We have a lot of what the world wants. And we just need to be able to pull that material out of the ground responsibly, which I believe we do well in a world-class basis, and then feed the world with what they need. And so, for example, just a few years ago, the German Chancellor came over to Canada soon after the war in Ukraine had erupted and was seeking natural gas. Right? And our prime minister at the time's, retort was, well, we can't help you today. Right? And so it really left, what I could see as important money on the table, given the vast natural gas resources that we have. And, just a few months ago now, we've had the opening of Canada's first liquefied natural gas terminal in Kitimat, which is, I'd say, a huge success story, a big development, but maybe a little bit late to the party. But these efforts are ones that I think we need to consider, okay, well, how did that happen? How do we start to replicate that to make sure that the right people are making the right decisions and projects and shovels are being put into the ground?
And so obviously we come to the present day and we've seen this C5 Act go through, and everybody understands the background of the Trump government and the challenges to Canada and Carney being elected. Just tell us a little bit, not every listener will be really familiar with it, the One Canadian Economy Act. We're not going to go into detail, but what are the basic principles behind that act?
Yeah, so I think it's really meant to be a nation-building policy, right? One that is focused on infrastructure development while we're in sort of a slowing economy stage here, almost stagnating economy, ensuring that we're able to knock down trade borders between provinces and find ways to get capital and money in the hands of developers, and financing schemes so that we can get projects built, while also recognizing the important role that Canadians' Indigenous communities have and the stake that they maintain in the development of our economy.
Got it. And so what's your prognosis for how this plays out? Because Carney obviously came into power with a mandate for being a little bit more a lot more pushy, proactive about taking the Canadian economy and the growth of that economy seriously. What's your sense of how successful he's going to be over the next? Because at the moment he's still essentially in this honeymoon period where we're kind of fighting the challenges we're getting from down south. How's it going to play out?
Yeah, so I don't have a crystal ball. I like to always say that as an economist too, I'm terrible at making forecasts, right? Yeah. But I think we have a window of an opportunity here. Right. Okay, and that window could be short. We have people in his cabinet like Tim Hodgson, for instance, that have very good sense of the industry and how projects can get developed and the financing of that as well. And so my hope would be that we could find a way to get all the players together and projects built. But I think the next 6 months will be very telling on this. Right. We have different provinces coming up with projects that they have a key interest in. I spoke to some leaders out in Nova Scotia not long ago about offshore wind projects. But what I'd like to see are developers, actual firms coming up with these initiatives, and not necessarily just provincial leaders or premiers that are putting these forward. There has to be a real commercial angle to what's happening.
So let's explore that for a second. The public-private partnerships, if you want to call it that. And I recall we interviewed Bill Morneau a couple of months back, and of course he was the finance minister at the time when the Trans Mountain Extension pipeline was built, was invested in, and my understanding is essentially the federal government stepped in because BC and Alberta couldn't agree, and the US company that had owned it basically said, we're not going to invest. I mean, building on that example, should we be trying to find ways of getting more private money into these types of investments? Or should the federal government just be essentially, running up the debt and investing itself?
In practicality, I think it's more both, right? That the government needs to have a hand in de-risking the projects, right? That Canada cannot be seen as a place where things can't get done, and the government has a role to play in this. The Canadian Infrastructure Bank could be one outlet for where that is happening.
Just say a bit more about the Canadian Infrastructure Bank.
Yeah, so it's a crown corporation that the government created not long ago, actually, to try and fund infrastructure projects in the country. It was slow going at the beginning, but now you've seen new developments come on and the speeding up of these types of efforts. There's a story most recently about sort of ferry systems in British Columbia that they're funding in, the things that you need to enhance the productivity of this country. And so, institutions like that have an important role, but you need the business people of this country to also step up and identify where are the priorities, okay? Where are we actually going to be world leading in our efforts and return to perhaps where we were, I would say about 20 years ago now, in being a highly productive and well-integrated economy.
Yeah. But inevitably, as some of these projects get put forward, we're going to sort of fall back into old practices, which is different branches of government have each got their own regulatory systems. And I was reading up in advance and reading of specific examples where it feels like your proposal goes into a black hole, of the government, and it gets got kicked around, and you don't hear anything for a year. I mean, any sort of insights or thoughts on how that can be resolved?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is the ultimate question, right? Is the black box of regulation and understanding how that process could get sped up. And you do always have these initiatives in some provinces to cut the red tape and, cut back. And we see a lot of that obviously going on in the U.S. As well. It doesn't necessarily mean anything moves quicker, but I do see a real effort in bills like C5 and other initiatives from the government to change the queuing system for approvals, right? And that when you have a commercial ready project, it's going to move up a lot quicker and move through perhaps a parallel process, one that requires the right level of scrutiny, but not necessarily something that's going to take years to develop and hundreds of millions of dollars on the developer side to be sitting on their hands and waiting. We just can't afford to do that anymore. And so I do see these initiatives coming out of the federal government to change that process.
Right. So let's move to, sort of linking to what we've just been discussing and almost linking it back to some of your research, because obviously you spent a lot of time in these earlier studies looking at the strategies of firms as they respond to different forms of regulation on one side and activism on the other. If you're advising companies at a very sort of generic level, what's your advice to them in terms of engaging with these various different activist groups and so forth?
Yeah, so I think from the work that I've done, you need to engage early and often. Right. And you see projects here in Canada that have been successful are the ones that found collaborative relationships with partners that are willing to work with you. And it's not always the case, perhaps, but often is that there's some ground to find where a project could get developed and opportunities provided to those that have concerns. And so, for instance, I think a great example of this was the Coastal GasLink pipeline that was developed in British Columbia to feed the natural gas into the LNG project that was developed in Kitimat. And their TC Energy now, negotiated impact and benefit agreements with, I believe it was 21 different Indigenous communities over years, and was really working with these communities to educate them about what the project and development would include, what the opportunities were for them to participate as partners within those, and then also to express any concerns that they have with where that pipeline would go and environmental or traditional issues that this development would have. And without that pipeline, this $40 billion project that we have in British Columbia would never have come to existence. And so I think that's a great example of a strategy that firms need to take. You can't put your paperwork into the federal government and then start a conversation. The conversation has to happen years before you actually put that in. And this goes back to are we going to get projects done? I think the projects that are going to get done are the ones where these conversations have already begun.
Right, got it. And of course, Canada's got, compared to some other countries like the UK, it's got a big Indigenous community of people across the country. How do we deal with that set of challenges, opportunities in a more effective way? Because obviously the risk is it's just another stakeholder group who is going to slow things down. But, there must be proactive ways of doing that.
Yeah, and so I think the number one thing is that it's not just another stakeholder group, right? And so this has to be looked upon as from a nation-to-nation perspective. And this is what's often different from the academic literature in dealing with communities or stakeholders. It's probably a lot closer to some of your work in terms of how, companies from one country deal with companies from another country or a government in another country. And that's the perspective that needs to be brought on. And what I've seen over my time since I've returned to Canada and became a lot more involved with these issues is how do you bring these groups together, these nations together as active participants, okay? And today, equity ownership is table stakes, that these communities are looking for investment.
I'm building a mine and I give a percentage of that mine to the original landowners. Is that?
I would say it's more than that, right? Because you're not just providing them the equity ownership, you're providing the opportunity for them to invest in the equity of that project, okay? Which is a different sort of mindset as well. In the past, a lot of the consultation that would go on and engagement go on would be investing in a community. right? Or providing some sort of benefit or service. Now it's actually bringing them on to have voice in what that project's going to involve, and then benefit both with the risk and the reward of what's going to happen there. We've got a great example of that not far from here. Six Nations of the Grand River, which is a community that's close to Brantford, right? We work very closely with the executive development officer there, and they've got investments now in billions of dollars of renewable energy technology and Canada's largest electricity battery storage project, and really have sort of built upon that. And it all began with equity investments in the first stage of the renewable power push here in Ontario in sort of the 2010s, 2011s.
Change focus slightly towards, you've been here now for 15 odd years. You've been our MBA program director. You've been teaching our students on all these topics. How do you engage our students in these issues? So the question is, what is it that our students need to know about these types of issues to make them successful in their business and sometimes government careers?
Yeah, and so I've learned as well. And so I guess one key lesson that I've taken out to when I teach these concepts is the notion of perspective taking. Right? That it's very easy at a business school to be focused on the commercial perspective, the developer, the firm, the bank, whatever it is, right? What I found to be quite effective is to position the students into different perspectives, right? Start to, take on that role of, let's say the CEO of an executive of economic development center at an Indigenous community that's considering investment of this type. And this is where the case method here is quite effective, because you have to start to consider the perspectives of different players and have some back and forth and a narrative that goes on. And this is something that I've done in all our programs and with executives as well. And it really opens up a different level of conversation on how you could reach cooperative relationships with groups that you may not be predisposed to initially.
Got it. And so, if you wouldn't mind just playing out a brief example of that, what would be a case that you would teach where you're asking the students to take these different perspectives?
Yeah, so we just published a new case on Hydro One, which is the large transmission entity here in Ontario, one of the largest transmission companies in North America, looking to produce and build a new transmission line in Northern Ontario, which is really important, actually, going back to resource development in this country, because we need to be able to have power to mine some of the resources that we have there. And, in that case, Hydro One was negotiating with, I believe it was 4 or 5 different Indigenous communities that would be impacted by this new transmission line, but would also benefit from having more reliable electricity up and cheaper electricity up in Northern Ontario. And so, there we asked students to take on different perspectives. Right, that of the developer, that of the policymaker, that of an Indigenous community, and think about how that negotiation would ensue as they're working towards an impact and benefit agreement, which is how you tend to now develop arrangements, formal arrangements between firms and Indigenous communities in Canada.
So before we close, Adam, a couple of final questions. First, what are you working on now? What are your next exciting projects that you'd like to be reporting on in a couple of years' time?
Yeah, of course, right? So pursuing a number of different areas related to this area of conversation that we've had. One paper that I'm particularly excited about that I'm working on with some colleagues here at Ivey is looking at how nuclear firms have been targeted by activists in the past and the technology choices that they make in response. Should they abandon nuclear technology? And why I think this is really important for us right now is, as we're in the midst of important energy transition here, we've got Ontario, Alberta, Saskatchewan, possibly even Quebec, looking at new nuclear investment. We're talking about billions. We're talking about tens of billions of dollars of investment that could potentially go into this, both in small modular reactors, but also new builds of large new generation technologies, which I think can be an important part of our energy mix. But they're going to face some challenges, both at the policy side, but also with local communities and Indigenous communities as well. And thinking about, should we not be able to develop that baseload technology, then what options they have out there? And so, this paper that we're working on is looking at historically, what went on and what perhaps led to choices that were optimal in the immediate and pragmatic, but in the longer run, had a much more severe impact on the environment and the economy.
Got it. And if business leaders or policymakers who've been listening today only remember one thing, or maybe two things from the last half hour, what should it be?
I think number one is, let's find cooperative agreements that we could develop with activists, communities, even those that support the projects we have there, and engage early.
Right.
I think that can't be understated. You can't expect that the policy process is going to work as envisaged, and success involves laying, a lot of groundwork out there beforehand.
Got it. And I sense a certain optimism that we're turning a corner here, that the current government is doing the right things in terms of helping us to kind of get the country moving again. Is that right?
Yeah, I think the window's here, right? Exactly. If we don't act on this now, then I don't know when we will. Fine. Right. And I believe that we've got the leaders now that have our best interests in mind. And, now it's, our job at Ivey and business leaders in this country to start to find a way to get projects done.
Yeah, perfect. What a great way to end. Thank you. You have been listening to Dialogue with the Dean from Ivey Business School. A big thank you to my guest, Adam Fremeth, for sharing his time and insights. And of course, thank you for tuning in. Until next time, goodbye.
This was Dialogue with the Dean, an Ivey Impact Podcast series. For more insights from Ivey, including thought leadership on critical issues and additional podcast episodes, visit ivyimpact.ca or subscribe on your preferred podcast platform. Thanks for tuning in.